Look at his eyes, one blue, one dark as the night. Ancient historians wrote about it, his generals noticed it, even his enemies, the ones who faced him across the battlefield, mentioned it. He had two completely different eyes, and somehow that felt right. Because Alexander was never just one man. He was the boy who sat in a meadow with Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, discussing medicine, stars, and the nature of the human soul. And he was also the man who, drunk at a banquet, hurled a spear through the chest of his closest friend. He wept for days after, but the spear had already flown. He was the king who knelt in the Egyptian desert to hear a god declare him his son, and the general who marched his army through a waterless wasteland for weeks, just to prove it could be done. He never lost a single battle, not one. In 11 years of war across 3 continents, no army ever sent him home. He was 32 years old when he collapsed in Babylon. Fever, pain, then silence. For 6 days, his body lay in that palace, and it did not decay, not even slightly. His soldiers, his generals, his doctors all walked in and saw the same thing. He looked alive. The ancient Greeks had only one explanation for that. He was a god. He had simply gone home. But here's what modern science now suggests, and this is the part that will stay with you. He may not have been dead yet. This is the story of Alexander of Macedon, the son of a broken royal family, the student of the greatest mind of his time, the man who looked at the entire known world and decided it was not enough, and the mystery of what or who finally stopped him. In 356 BC, in a small cold city called Pella, in the kingdom of Macedonia, a boy was born into a world that was already complicated. Macedonia was not Greece. The great cities of Athens and Thebes looked down on it. They called Macedonians half-barbarians, rough people, soldiers, not thinkers. And the royal family, the Argead dynasty, was as turbulent as any in the ancient world. Murders, betrayals, remarriages, power held by whoever was willing to grab it and not let go. His father was Philip II, and Philip was a genius. In a generation, he had taken a poor, backward kingdom and turned it into the most powerful military force in the known world. He invented new battle tactics. He built an army around a weapon called the sarissa, an 18-foot pike that no enemy formation could stop. He was political, patient, and ruthless. He conquered northern Greece not just with soldiers, but with marriages, bribes, and promises. His mother was Olympias, and Olympias was a different kind of force entirely. She was passionate, fiercely intelligent, and utterly devoted to one single idea, that her son was not just a prince, but something more. She told Alexander from the time he could understand words that his real father was not Philip. His real father was Zeus, the king of the gods. She believed this, and she made sure Alexander believed it too. Growing up between these two people, the calculating war machine and the woman who told him he was divine, Alexander had no ordinary childhood. Philip was almost never home. He was always at war, always expanding. And when he was home, the relationship between father and son was electric with tension. Philip admired his son, but he also feared what he was becoming. The moment that defined Alexander's childhood, the moment that told everyone watching exactly who this boy was, came when he was 12 years old. A horse dealer arrived at the Macedonian court with a magnificent black stallion named Bucephalus. Broad-headed, powerful, wild-eyed. The asking price was 13 talents, an enormous sum. Philip's best riders tried to mount him one by one. The horse threw them all. Philip decided the animal was useless and ordered him taken away. That is when Alexander spoke. He told his father that these men were failing because they were afraid of the horse. And because of that fear, they were making the horse afraid too. Philip looked at his 12-year-old son and essentially said, "If you can do better, go ahead.
Welcome to my hall,
And if you
ambassadors.
fail,
May our
you
discussions
pay
be
the
fruitful.
full
Thank you,
price."
Commander. We bring
Alexander
tidings of
walked
peace
toward
from
the
southern
horse,
deltas.
slowly.
stance is
He
weak,
had been
recruit.
watching the
Tighten
whole
your
time,
formation.
and he
Now,
had noticed
intensify the
something
drill.
nobody else
Faster.
bothered to notice. Bucephalus was terrified of his own shadow. The movement of the dark shape on the ground beneath him was sending him into a panic. So Alexander turned him to face the sun. Just that. He turned the horse so that the shadow fell behind them both, out of sight. Then he spoke gently, stroked the horse's neck, and climbed onto his back. And Bucephalus ran, not in panic, but in full, joyful stride, with Alexander on him, completely in control. When they came back, Philip was in tears, and he said to his son, "Macedonia is too little for thee. You need a kingdom worthy of who you are." It was the greatest thing his father ever said to him, and it was also, in a way, the beginning of everything that followed. But that same father who wept with pride was about to betray him in the worst possible way. When Alexander was 13, his father did something remarkable. He hired Aristotle to be his son's teacher. Aristotle was not simply a philosopher. He was perhaps the greatest single mind the ancient world ever produced. He had studied under Plato. He had theories about everything: biology, ethics, politics, astronomy, poetry, medicine. He approached the world with an insatiable need to understand it. And for 3 years, in a place called Mieza, far from the distractions of the court, he sat with Alexander in gardens and open air and talked about everything. He gave Alexander an annotated copy of the Iliad, Homer's great epic about war and glory and the short lives of great men. Alexander carried that book with him for the rest of his life. He slept with it under his pillow next to a dagger. What Aristotle taught him about tactics, medicine, philosophy, and the nature of leadership made Alexander the commander he became. But what Alexander ultimately did with the world, the way he refused Aristotle's view that non-Greeks were lesser people, the way he tried to blend cultures and peoples into something entirely new, that was a place where the student went far beyond the teacher.
While you discuss the
Back at the
nature of
court,
reality,
something
my
was
soldiers
breaking.
bleed on the
Philip
frontier.
had remarried.
Your wisdom
His new
will not
wife,
save this
Cleopatra, a Macedonian noblewoman, not to be confused with the Egyptian queen, came from pure Macedonian blood. And that mattered, because if she produced a son, that son would have a stronger claim to the throne than Alexander, whose mother was foreign-born. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle stood and made a toast. He called on the gods to grant Philip a legitimate heir. Alexander, who was sitting right there, stood up and hurled his cup at the man. Philip drew his sword and lurched toward his own son, and then fell. He was drunk. Alexander looked at his father on the floor and said coldly, "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." He and his mother fled the kingdom that night. They were eventually allowed to return, but the damage was done. The trust between Philip and Alexander was fractured. And then, at a theater in the city of Aegae, during the wedding celebration for Alexander's sister, Philip was stabbed. murdered by a Macedonian nobleman in full view of the crowd. Many people suspected that Olympias had arranged it. Some suspected Alexander. The truth has never been established with certainty. What is certain is that Alexander was 20 years old, and suddenly the most powerful military in the world was his. A lot of people thought he would not last. The Greek city-states immediately began to revolt. Some thought this young king was just Philip's spoiled son, that without the father, there was nothing. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Alexander moved fast, faster than anyone expected. He marched south into Greece and put down the revolts before they could organize. Athens, which had celebrated Philip's death, suddenly went quiet. And then Thebes, one of the great city-states, home of the legendary Sacred Band, tried to expel the Macedonian garrison from its citadel. Alexander destroyed Thebes. He razed it to the ground, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. 30,000 people were sold into slavery. He sent a message to every city in Greece. This is what rebellion costs. Athens immediately sent ambassadors pledging loyalty. With Greece pacified and his northern borders secured, Alexander turned east. His official reason was a war of liberation, to free the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor from Persian control, to avenge Persia's burning of Athens 150 years before. But everyone who knew him understood the real reason. He wanted Persia, all of it. He crossed the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BC with roughly 40 000 men and almost no money. The Persian Empire, with its 50 million subjects, its vast treasury, its network of roads stretching from Greece to India, was the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And Alexander was going to take it. At the Granicus River, in his very first battle against Persian forces, Alexander rode directly into the thickest part of the fighting. A Persian officer came at him from behind and swung his sword at Alexander's head. It connected and was stopped at the last fraction of a second by a Macedonian officer named Clitus the Black, who cut off the Persian's arm before the blow could land. Alexander did not forget that. Clitus had saved his life, and Alexander knew it. He moved down the coast of Asia Minor, city by city, liberating Greek populations, reorganizing governments, cutting off the Persian fleet from its supply ports. In 333 BC at Issus, he met the Persian king Darius III in open battle for the first time. Darius had a larger army. Alexander had a plan. He identified where Darius himself was positioned in the battle line and rode straight at him. The plan was not to win the battle on the flanks. The plan was to terrify the king. It worked. Darius fled his own chariot. His army, seeing the king run, collapsed. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. He treated them with complete dignity. He addressed Darius's mother as a queen. He paid for the funeral of Darius's wife when she died in his camp. Then came Tyre. Tyre was a city built on an island half a mile off the coast of Lebanon. It was considered impregnable. Alexander decided to take it anyway. When the Tyrians refused to surrender, he spent 7 months building a causeway from the mainland to the island, a man-made land bridge across open sea under constant attack from the city's walls. It was an engineering project of staggering ambition. And when the causeway reached the walls, Alexander's army poured through. The storming of Tyre in July 330 BC was, by any military standard, Alexander's greatest technical achievement. The city fell. The Persian navy, which had relied on Tyre as its base, lost its last major port. Persia could no longer threaten Greece from the sea. From Tyre, Alexander moved into Egypt. The Egyptians did not resist. They opened their gate and welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. In Memphis, he made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods and was crowned as Pharaoh. He founded a new city on the coast, Alexandria, which would go on to become one of the most important cities in human history. But it was what happened in the desert that changed him forever. Alexander traveled to the oasis of Siwa in the Libyan desert to consult the oracle of the god Amun. The journey took weeks across sand and heat. When he arrived and entered the inner sanctuary, the priest came out and addressed him not as a king, but as the son of the god. Alexander never publicly revealed what the oracle said to him in private, but from that day forward, he began referring to Zeus Ammon as his true father. He started to genuinely believe, or at least to act as though he believed, that he was not entirely human. He was 25 years old. He had never lost a battle. And now, a god had confirmed what his mother had told him since childhood. With the Nile behind him and Egypt secure, Alexander turned back east, toward the heart of Persia. He had unfinished business with Darius. On October 1st, 331 BC, on a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq, Alexander faced the largest army he had ever encountered. Darius had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. He had chosen the battlefield carefully, a wide open plain called Gaugamela, which he had ordered flattened by workers to give his chariots room to operate. He had war elephants brought from India, 200 scythed chariots, and an army that outnumbered Alexander's force of 47. Borrowed men by at least 2 to 1, possibly far more. Some ancient accounts, almost certainly exaggerated, claimed over 1 million Persian troops were present. Even the conservative modern estimates suggest Alexander was massively outnumbered. His generals urged him to attack at night, to use the darkness to neutralize the Persian numbers. Alexander refused. He would not steal a victory, he said. He would take it in the open. He could not sleep the night before. One of his generals found him in his tent at dawn, calm and already dressed for battle, and could not understand how a man facing those odds had slept so soundly. Alexander's answer was simple. Darius had finally stopped running and come to fight. There was nothing left to worry about. The battle that followed was a masterwork. Alexander moved his cavalry to the right, drawing the Persian left to follow, deliberately pulling their line apart. He watched for the gap that would open in the Persian center. And when it appeared, he turned and charged directly through it, straight at Darius. Again, as at Issus, the sight of Alexander coming for him personally broke the Persian king. Darius fled. His army, watching their king abandon the field, fell apart. The greatest empire in the world had just lost its army. Babylon opened its gates without a fight. Susa surrendered. Alexander walked into the treasury of Darius and found wealth so vast that it took 20 Soudan mules and 5 Oiros camels to carry it away. And then he came to Persepolis. Persepolis was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the most magnificent city in the world. Alexander's troops looted it for months. And then, one night, at a banquet with wine flowing, it burned. Exactly why has been debated ever since. Some ancient sources say it was a calculated political act, a symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens. Others say a woman named Thais, an Athenian courtesan, suggested it as a game, and Alexander, drunk, agreed. What is certain is that Alexander watched the palace of Xerxes burn, and that by morning he reportedly walked through the ruins with regret. But the burning of Persepolis was not the worst thing that happened in those years. The worst thing happened at a banquet in the city of Maracanda in 328 BC. By this point, Alexander had changed. He had begun dressing in Persian robes. He expected Persian customs of respect from his court, including a form of bowing called proskynesis, which Macedonians considered deeply undignified, something you did only before a god. His oldest companions, the men who had grown up with him, watched their king disappear into something they did not recognize. Clitus the Black was among those men, the same Clitus who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. That night at the banquet, he had been drinking heavily, and when flatterers around Alexander began dismissing the achievements of Philip, suggesting that everything great in Macedonian history had been Alexander's work alone, Clitus could not stay quiet. He stood and said what everyone else was too afraid to say. He told Alexander that his victories belonged to all of them, to the Macedonian soldiers who bled for him, to his father who built the army that made conquest possible. He held up his hand, the same hand that had blocked the sword at the Granicus, and reminded the king of it. Alexander's rage was immediate and absolute. His bodyguards grabbed him. Others pulled Clitus from the room. For a moment, it seemed the night would end without disaster, but Clitus came back. He had one more thing to say. Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and drove it through Clitus's chest. The room went silent. The oldest friend he had, the man who had literally saved his life, lay dead on the floor, and Alexander, as the wine fog began to clear, understood what he had done. He pulled the spear from the body and reportedly tried to turn it on himself. His guards stopped him. He locked himself in his quarters for 3 days, refused food, refused water, and did nothing but grieve. He eventually came out, but the man who walked out of that room was different from the one who had walked in, and his men knew it. The trust that had held everything together, the belief that Alexander was not just a king, but one of them, had a crack in it that would never fully heal. Alexander kept moving east, always east. He crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains into what is now Afghanistan twice, fighting a brutal guerrilla war in mountain terrain that no army had ever managed before. He crossed into what is now Pakistan, and in 326 BC, he came to the Hydaspes River, where a king named Porus was waiting for him on the other side with an army that included war elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes was different from everything before it. Porus was not Darius. He did not run. He stood his ground, organized his forces with real intelligence, and fought Alexander to a draw for long stretches of the battle. When it was over, when Alexander had won at considerable cost, he rode up to the captured Porus and asked how he wished to be treated. Porus looked at him and said, like a king, Alexander let him keep his kingdom. He made him an ally. It was one of the few moments in all those years where you could see something in Alexander beyond ambition, a genuine respect for a man who had faced him without flinching. But the victory at Hydaspes came at a cost that Alexander had not expected. Bucephalus, his horse, his companion since he was 12 years old, The horse he had turned toward the sun on that field in Macedonia, the horse that had carried him through every battle for 20 years. Bucephalus died after the fight at the Hydaspes, either from wounds sustained in battle or from the weight of his years. Alexander was devastated. He founded a city on the banks of that river and named it Bucephala in his horse's memory. The city stood for centuries, and then at the Hyphasis River, the next river east, at the edge of what his men could see on the maps, they stopped. They refused to go further. These were men who had followed him through deserts and mountains and ice and heat, who had crossed 3 continents, who had fought in dozens of battles over more than a decade. But they had families they had not seen in years. They were exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. And standing at that riverbank, looking at another river, another unknown country, another war, they simply said no. Their general Conus spoke for them. He stood before Alexander and said, respectfully but clearly, that the men wanted to go home. They wanted to see their parents while they were still alive. They wanted to meet the children who had been born after they left. Alexander was furious. He went to his tent and did not come out for 3 days. He waited for them to change their minds. They did not. For the first time in his life, the only time, the world had told Alexander no, and there was nothing he could do about it. He came out of his tent. He built 12 enormous altars on the riverbank, marking the edge of his empire. And then he turned west for the first time in 11 years. He never fully recovered from that moment, not emotionally. The mutiny at the Hyphasis was not a military defeat. His men loved him, and they showed it on the march home. But it was a defeat of a different kind. The march itself was brutal. He led part of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a scorching wasteland in what is now Pakistan and Iran, where heat and thirst killed thousands. Whether it was punishment for the mutiny or simply Alexander pushing himself because he did not know how else to exist, no one can say for certain. He was going home, but home had changed, and so had he. In 323 BC, Alexander was in Babylon. He was 32 years old, and he was planning his next campaign. It sounds impossible given everything, but he was already drawing up detailed plans to conquer Arabia. After Arabia, possibly Carthage. After Carthage, possibly Rome. His notebooks, recovered after his death and read aloud to his generals, described 1,000 warships larger than anything built before, roads to be constructed along the African coast, a massive blending of Eastern and Western populations into a single culture, enormous temples to be built across the empire. He was not tired. His body was tired. His army was tired. But the hunger was exactly what it had always been. He had also just lost Hephaestion. Hephaestion was his closest friend. Some ancient writers say his closest companion in every sense of the word. The two had grown up together, trained together, and fought beside each other for their entire lives. When Hephaestion died of fever in the city of Ecbatana in 324 BC, Alexander's grief was so extreme that it frightened people around him. He fasted for days. He ordered the horsetails of the entire cavalry to be cut as a sign of mourning. He petitioned the oracle at the oasis of Siwa to have Hephaestion declared a god. He planned a funeral monument that would have cost $10,000 talents, a sum almost beyond comprehension. The man who walked into Babylon in the spring of 323 BC was carrying that grief with him on top of everything else. On the evening of June 1st, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by a Macedonian officer named Medius. He drank heavily, as he often did in those years. Late in the night, he was struck by a sudden sharp pain in his back, described by those who were there as like being pierced by a spear. He was helped back to his quarters. Over the next 11 days, the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen was slowly destroyed by whatever had entered his body. He developed a high fever, then chills, then sweating, then the pain spread. He lost his ability to eat. His voice faded until he could no longer speak. His body, which had survived wounds that should have killed him, an arrow through his lung in India, a sword stroke at Granicus, a rock to the head that left him unconscious, could not fight this invisible enemy. On the 9th day, when his soldiers heard rumors that he was already dead, they demanded to be allowed to see him. The doors of the palace were opened. His generals and officers and common soldiers filed through his chamber in silence. And Alexander, who could no longer speak, who could no longer move, looked at each one of them as they passed. He recognized them. He raised his eyes in acknowledgement. He struggled to lift his head. Some of them were weeping. He had never seen his men weep before. His generals gathered and asked him, as he lay there, to whom he left his empire. And Alexander, or the version of Alexander that history has carried forward, said 3 words: to the strongest. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. And then the strangest thing of all. 6 days passed, and his body did not decay. His skin did not change. His color remained. The ancient sources record that when the embalmers arrived from Egypt and Chaldea, they found him looking as though he were still alive. They hesitated to begin their work. The ancient Greeks had a ready explanation. He was a god, and the body of a god did not rot. Modern science has a different theory. In 2018, a physician named Dr. Catherine Hall at the University of Otago proposed that Alexander may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disorder in which the body's immune system attacks its own nerves, causing progressive paralysis. The paralysis would have made his breathing nearly invisible. And in the ancient world where doctors determined death by breath, not pulse, he may have been declared dead while he was still alive, aware of his surroundings, unable to move or speak, listening to his generals argue over who would inherit his world. It may be, Dr. Hall wrote, the most famous case of a false diagnosis of death ever recorded, which means the 6 days of freshness were not a miracle. They were the last 6 days of a man who was still there inside a body that had stopped answering. We do not know. We may never know. His tomb has never been found. His body was taken to Egypt, placed in a golden coffin, and became one of the most visited monuments in the ancient world for centuries. Julius Caesar wept in front of it. Augustus Caesar reportedly accidentally broke off the nose when reaching forward to touch the face. And then, at the end of the 4th century AD, all written records of the tomb simply stopped. It vanished from history as completely as if it had never existed. The empire died with him almost immediately. His generals, the men he had commanded, trained, trusted, turned on each other within weeks. The 40 years of war that followed his death are known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. They were some of the bloodiest and most chaotic conflicts the ancient world ever produced, His son, born months after his death, was eventually murdered. His mother, Olympias, was killed. His wives were killed. Everything he had built by personal force of will began to fracture the moment that will was gone. But something else survived. Everywhere Alexander had marched, he had left cities. He founded over 20 of them, many named Alexandria, scattered from Egypt to the edge of Pakistan. These cities were not just military outposts. They were centers of trade, culture, and learning. They mixed Greek with Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, Indian. They created something the world had never had before, a shared civilization that stretched across 3 continents and spoke one language. That language was Greek. And because of Alexander, Greek became the language of knowledge, commerce, and religion for the next 5 centuries. The New Testament was written in Greek. The philosophy that shaped Western civilization was written in Greek. The science, the medicine, the mathematics, all of it spread because one young man from a cold kingdom in the north decided the world needed to be one thing. His tactics are still studied in military academies. His name is still given to children. His story has been told and retold in every language on earth for more than 2,000 years. And what is it about him exactly that makes it impossible to look away? It is not the battles. There have been other great generals. It is not the empire. It lasted barely a generation. It is the image of the man himself, the boy who turned a horse toward the sun, the student who carried Homer into war, the king who wept over a dead horse and killed his best friend in the same year, the conqueror who stood at the edge of the known world, heard his men say no for the first and only time, and went back to his tent for 3 days because he simply did not know what to do when the world refused him. He was not a god. He was something more interesting than that. He was a person who burned so completely for glory, for conquest, for something he could never quite name, that the fire consumed him before he turned 33. And 2,000 years later, we are still standing in the warmth of it.